Dallas-Fort Worth. This is North Texas in Focus. This show takes a closer look at issues and concerns around the Metroplex. We bring you the show on 88.1 Indy and 881indy.com.
Hi, I'm Matthew Reyna. This is North Texas in Focus. My guest on the program today is Jeffrey Kahn. Professor Kahn is a professor of law at SMU's Dedmon School of Law. Kahn is an expert on Russian law, and his work on Russia has been published in the New York Times, Dallas Morning News, and countless academic journals. With the conflict in Ukraine being a mystery to many of us in the United States, I brought Kahn on this week's program to discuss why Americans should be paying attention to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As the Russian invasion enters its 9th month, it's taken a backseat in the headlines to the U.S. midterm elections. But what's happening in that part of the world is still critically important. According to the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, more than 6,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed since the start of the conflict. Recently, U.S. officials confirmed that Russian military leaders discussed using a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. And Russia's hesitancy to guarantee safe passage for Ukrainian grain shipments in the Black Sea has contributed to the global food crisis. I spoke to Professor Kahn on Monday afternoon, and we discussed the threat of nuclear war, the current state of the conflict in Ukraine, and potential signs that the Western alliance is wavering in its support of Ukrainians. To start our discussion, I asked Professor Kahn to explain why journalists should refer to Ukraine simply as Ukraine and not the Ukraine, as I did when we were chatting before the show.
It's generally considered a bad form in English to refer to Ukraine as a country as the Ukraine. This is seen as taking a Russia-centric perspective because the Ukraine suggests a borderland, a periphery space. The root word in Russian of edge or border sounds an awful lot like Ukraine or Ukraine. And so you want to be a little bit careful to simply refer to Ukraine rather than the Ukraine. It's a sovereign state in its own right, and that's why this war is just as critically important for the international world order as it really is.
And why should folks here in North Texas and across America more broadly be paying attention to this war?
Well, I mentioned the international world order, and maybe more accurately, I should speak about the international legal order. It has been a founding principle since World War II that members of the United Nations would refrain from aggressive war, that wars of aggression, wars of choice to acquire territory, to seize something from another state are per se illegal. They are violations of international law. And what you're seeing in this war is a war of aggression. This was a war of choice by Russia against Ukraine. It's an invasion, and it's an invasion to acquire territory. The precedents for this war are going back to 2014. You'll recall that the peninsula of Crimea, which is a sovereign part of Ukraine, was seized by Russia, first surreptitiously and then quite overtly. Roughly about the same time in the winter of 2014, Russia encouraged, if it did not, again, surreptitiously participate in violent actions to separate the eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, from the rest of the country. This is an attempt to seize and control territory and destabilize a sovereign state. It is per se illegal. And there's a very, very good reason why we want that international legal order to remain in place. We've had a pretty good run after World War II of preventing major wars. We've had, unfortunately, lots of regional wars. But what you're seeing now in this space is the largest war in Europe since World War II, the largest movement of refugees since World War II. Massive losses of life, massive destructions of property and economies with global impacts, including a worldwide food shortage. And in addition to all of those catastrophes, if we are going to now live in a world where one state can attack another state because it wants to change the borders, you're living in a much, much more dangerous world. It's a world where China might seek to acquire Taiwan. It's a world where India and Pakistan may feel much freer about fighting over disputed territories and spaces. So many of the borders in our world are contested. They are the result of colonialism. They are the result of imperialism. They are the result of lots of conflicts in history. If all of those conflicts are opened up and it's just going to be survival of the fittest and strongest, then you would see the war that is being experienced in Ukraine replicated all over the globe. And this is sometimes hard for Americans to understand. Ukraine is roughly the geographic size of Texas. But if you look at the borders of Texas, you'll see a lot of straight lines. Straight lines are very unusual on a world map. And that's because so many spaces are very contested spaces. And the international legal prohibition on wars of aggression is about trying to live with those histories and trying not to reopen those old wounds in very violent ways.
When Russia alludes to or hints at nuclear war or harkens back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I saw their foreign minister did last week, how concerned should we be about that kind of rhetoric?
We have to be very, very concerned for a number of reasons. First of all, the taboo in foreign affairs and in military contests, even given this international legal order that we have, the taboo we have on the use of nuclear weapons is at risk. We have not seen a use of a nuclear weapon in a theater of war since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those were terrible moments in history, and we lived through a Cold War in which Americans lived in daily fear that, as the world did, that we could destroy ourselves by accident or by retaliation. And so when one side starts rattling that nuclear saber, it's very, very worrisome. Mistakes can happen, confusion can happen, missed signals can happen. And aside from that, if indeed Russia decides to use in one form or another a nuclear weapon, such as a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, or even the use of a dirty bomb, which is not a nuclear weapon per se, but is a conventional weapon, which is wrapped with radioactive material so that when it explodes, it spreads that radioactive material in a frightening sphere of dispersal. All of those would break that taboo. And the question of what would be the appropriate response brings us very, very close to what the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists called midnight. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has, for many, many decades, shown a picture of a clock on its cover to show how many minutes towards midnight the world is, midnight being nuclear Armageddon. And so any leader that would rattle that saber is engaged in very, very dangerous rhetoric.
And is that leader, in this case, Vladimir Putin, in your estimation, is he a rational actor?
Yes, I think so. I think that it is a bit of a mistake for people to suppose as a starting premise that we are dealing with someone who is crazy or irrational as a way to try to explain what's going on. I don't think that we have any evidence that he has any sort of mental illness, but his perception of the world and of this international legal order is very, very different than the perception that we have in the United States and that our allies have, and certainly that Ukraine has. Vladimir Putin has said on numerous occasions that the single greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, including in the roster of catastrophes, the Holocaust, the use of atomic weapons in World War II, of all of the catastrophes of a very, very bloody century, the worst in his view was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one way to begin to perceive what's going on from his perspective is to take that as your starting point. And if you are the leader of a country that you feel has been dismembered, collapsed, shrunken at the end of the Cold War and betrayed by a West that, from his perspective, made certain security promises, like that NATO would not advance closer and closer to Russia's western borders. A highly disputed piece of diplomatic history, by the way. But if that's your perception, then the way you are going to be remembered in history as a great leader is to reverse that set of losses. And so one lens in which to perceive what's going on in Ukraine is to see that Vladimir Putin is trying to restore Soviet greatness. Now, there's a very disputed historical legacy over Crimea. There is a disputed historical legacy and a lot of language and religious politics in this border between Ukraine and Russia and in Eastern Europe in general. But one way to perceive what's going on is that he is seeking to reclaim what he perceives as Russia's rightful territory.
Well, the next question I was going to ask was, what's the current state of the war right now? But I guess following up on your answer right there, I would ask, will he be successful?
Well, I mean, both of those questions are important questions. And so we know from United Nations estimates, for instance, that as of late October 23rd, the verified civilian casualties in Ukraine have reached at least 16,000 or more human beings, according to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Over 6,300 civilians have been killed, and at least 9,700 have been injured in the past 8 months. And I should say that these statistics are probably too low, that more have been killed than even these high numbers. As far back as August, National Public Radio was reporting UNHCR statistics that 13 million people have been forced to flee their homes in Ukraine, including 6.6 million people who are internally displaced. Now, when you consider that the population of Ukraine is 43 million people, that's an astonishing number of people. Population of Texas, by comparison, is about 29 million. And so in terms of human loss and tragedy, it's an enormous number and an enormously high number of people who've been killed. Will he be successful? Well, that's a question of prediction on which an awful lot depends. So far, Ukraine has been able to rally world support. I don't think anybody expected that President Zelensky would have the sort of charisma and leadership that he has deployed to lead his country, both within Ukraine and in seeking help outside of Ukraine. We have seen a strong reaction from NATO, which will soon have, in all likelihood, 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. We have seen a strong response from allies in Europe, and of course, the sanctions program that's been led by the United States. Whether that can continue is a very, very hard question. The longer the war continues, the more fatigue we may see in a world that already is suffering from high inflation, that is suffering the after effects of a global pandemic. And programs like yours, therefore, are so important to increase understanding in people throughout the United States, and in particular Texas, of just how important it is that Vladimir Putin doesn't establish a new international legal order in which whoever happens to have a stronger army or more tolerance for destruction and death can acquire more territory. It would be a horrifyingly dismal world in which to live.
Do you see any early signs that Western political support for Ukraine is wavering in any way, or perhaps the opposite?
There are some discouraging signs coming from some members of Congress that their support for the war is wavering. They are the usual claims that America should think about America first, which is a a ludicrously simplistic way of thinking about the problem, because I think that when President Biden adopts a policy of strong support for Ukraine, he is thinking about America first, because America's role in the world and America's security in the world is closely linked to the international legal and world order that we were able to establish after World War II. To go back to a world of wars of aggression is a world that nobody would want, and it would be especially damaging for the United States. Think of the effect on trade. You can think, for instance, just of the effect on world hunger that this war has had. Ukraine is the breadbasket for the world. It has some of the finest soil and some enormous proportions of the world's wheat production come from this part of the world. Well, that has been severely damaged. And who suffers in a world like that? The hungry, the poor, places that are already in varying degrees of political and economic stability. And so you can really see an effect globally of this war of aggression that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. Now, it has been only 8 months that this war has gone on. I think we are at about day 248 or 250 now. And so we can only hope that the case can be clearly made about why this is in America's interests and, in fact, in the interests of the whole world.
Could you explain the link between that Russian aggression and higher energy prices in America and Europe, and how that may be something that would impact political support over here for the war?
Energy policy is not my specialty, so I don't think that that's something that I can opine on. But one concern that a lot of people have expressed is that Russia, of course, has been shipping natural gas to Europe, and many countries in Europe have become highly dependent on Russia for their energy supplies. For a long time, those energy pipelines traversed Ukraine, because, getting back to our previous conversation, a lot of the infrastructure in Ukraine and Russia goes back to a time when Ukraine was one of the Soviet Socialist republics in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and declarations of sovereignty and independence by many of those states, that infrastructure remained. Russia pursued a policy of developing pipelines called Nord Stream that would circumvent those Ukrainian transit pipelines and in that way deprive Ukraine of transit fees. And those pipeline projects, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, were supported in the West. So now there's a period of questioning, I think, about whether that was a good policy, a good policy to link energy in ways that affected security. How it is affecting world or U.S. energy prices, though, is something that I'm not sufficiently expert in to offer an opinion.
Mm-hmm. I suppose I'd want to wrap up on this, looking at the bigger picture. The death toll you mentioned among civilians in Ukraine is staggering. We've seen Russia threatening the world over the last couple months with talks of nuclear war. Yesterday, I read about the Russian government is going to go back on their agreement to let grain leave Ukraine and contribute to the world food crisis. So I guess I would say, could Russia ever again be a positive actor on the world stage after what we've seen over the last 240-something days?
This is an extremely important question, and it ties in closely with some research that I'm doing. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, essentially the same set of questions was being asked. How do you bring Russia and the countries that Russia formerly either controlled or influenced through the Warsaw Pact or as constituent parts of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, how do you bring them into a new world legal order? And anybody who lived through the 1990s will remember a time of really extraordinary optimism. In fact, there was even a book written called The End of History, because the idea was that now we've seen that Pluralist liberal democracy is the wave of the future, and the contest between different forms of government has now really been decided. So the Council of Europe, for example, admitted Russia to be a member. This is an organization, an international organization that is different than the European Union. And the Council of Europe has as its core goals the promotion of pluralist democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And the idea was to admit Russia in order to help Russia reform and achieve those things. But the success of those reforms was very partial. And Russia ultimately caused a great deal of trouble for the Council of Europe, flooding its docket, the docket of its Court of Human Rights with egregious cases of human rights violations. Russia continued to engage in violent conflicts both within its borders, with wars in Chechnya, and outside and along its borders with wars in Georgia, as well as I mentioned, the seizure of Crimea and the conflagration in Donetsk and Luhansk, on the eastern edge of Ukraine. So Russia was ultimately expelled from that organization. But this war will not last forever. Vladimir Putin will not live forever. It's a very difficult question of prediction what the next leader of Russia will look like. But policymakers around the world are going to have to decide whether the initial effort, which was a very good effort to try to bring Russia into a world of pluralism, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, is a sustainable project. In my view, it has to be, because the alternative is just too frightening to contemplate.
Well, Professor Kahn, thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Thank you, Matthew. It's very good to be on your program.
You're listening to North Texas in Focus on 88.1 Indy or 881indy.com. If you have something you'd like to hear addressed on a future show or any questions, you can send email to info@881indy.com. That's info@881indy.com.
Thank you to this week's guest, SMU Dedmon School of Law Professor of Law Jeffrey Kahn, for his expertise on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. To read more from Professor Kahn on Russia, check out his March op-ed in the Dallas Morning News titled "Russia's Withdrawal from the Council of Europe is a Loss of Hope for Human Rights," where he writes about Russia's full turn towards isolation over integration with its regional neighbors. That's it for today's program. For KNTU's North Texas in Focus, I'm Matthew Reyna.
This has been North Texas in Focus on 88.1 Indy and 881indy.com. If you have questions or information to share with us, you can send email to info@881indy.com. Thanks for listening.